So, Father, do give the time we've got to you this evening, and Lord Jesus, that there are. It's like I suppose like eating food is. We eat the fact we've eaten a meal one week doesn't mean we don't eat tomorrow and the day after and so on. And so Jesus, we just really do pray that there's that kind of ongoing sense of nourishment that never gets boring, because there is always a need to feed on you and always a need to take time with you. And so Jesus, just give the time we've got this evening and ask that you'd really bless us in it, in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So just a quick kind of background, because I sort of have explained what we're doing, but in terms of what I wanted to kind of get over the last few years, been wanting to kind of get out of my head and written down and so on, when it comes to the New Testament, the thing we did in London last month, where we produced the playbook, as I referred to it, which I've got my copy of here, if I can wave it at people. This copy, actually, we've just been on holiday last week. I left it in our summer house and it rained heavily. So as you can see, it's all kind of slightly warped because the conservatory bit in our house leaks. So it's now looks really well weathered, but actually it's a pretty new kind of resource. But it was a really fantastic step in my mind getting this out, even though I can find loads of mistakes in it, loads of little bits and pieces. But it was a big step towards the idea of giving people a resource that you can take away and you can work with, to kind of, if you like, equip those who are teaching themselves. And that's always been part of the heart, right from the very beginning. I had that kind of question in my head, is if I'm going to write stuff down, who's it for? And I came to the conclusion that it was for those that wanted to kind of pass on and teach others, as well as for those who just know they want to kind of feed themselves. And the two kind of often flow one to the other, isn't it? I found when I started teaching, the benefit I had from years of feeding myself. And so in one sense, if you are someone who feeds yourself, eventually you get to a place where the Spirit moves you and you think, well, I need to pass on what I know, not for the sake of arrogance or the sake of control or the sake of whatever, but just somehow it's part of that's almost that kind of sacred commission of what we've seen, what we've experienced, what we've heard, we try and pass on. And I'm a great fan and believer in the fact that we try and do it at a very personal level. I think some of the failure of the big kind of programs, it's not that there's everything wrong with them. It's not that everything is wrong. It's just that their failure is that there's something about the gospel which is uniquely kind of made sense of in the human spirit. And so as we mechanize it and we just turn and we produce the books and we produce the videos and we produce those kinds of things, which I'm doing myself, they themselves don't carry the life that the human heart does. And so what you want to do with those things is make them a resource for those who are processing their own journey and their own experience with the Lord. So this was, in my mind, is a big step, because it's something that people can take away and work with, and it may not be perfect, but it's kind of it gives the kind of information which I wish that I'd had years ago. And so what I wanted to do with these evening sessions is to kind of work through the material that's in here, and hopefully teach stuff that's not in here and give you some bits that aren't in there, but also to look at it from the point of view of how we can use this and how we can use this and pass this on to others in our kind of orbit and so on. And so that's the kind of the context. So tonight we're going to start the way that, if you've ever been to one of the presentations that I do on Jesus' last week, I often start by introducing the places, and then that leads on to introducing the people. And the reason for that is one of my kind of strong feelings. It feels like I'm kind of giving you lots of things. I say these are my strong feelings. This is really, it's just the shape of how you become who you are, isn't it? Is that I noticed the fact that God so loved the world, he didn't just give us the manifesto. He embedded that in the story, and the story is something that you can have a 5-page picture book and you can read it to a child and they can sit there wide-eyed as Jesus turns loaves and it multiplies. Multiplies bread and fish and so on, and you can get the stories, and they kind of embed into them, because there's something very uniquely human about the way we process knowledge and truth that loves a story. And so that story kind of conveys something at a very human level. And yet very often the way we have learnt to teach, not just the Bible, but loads of subject, is we've learnt to dissect them and break them down into little atoms and kind of give a piece at a time and then connect them up. Not at all story-like. And you have to have a certain type of brain to be able to process information that way. So right at the kind of the foundation, and I don't say that in any sense am I perfect at it, either now or in the past, but it's something that I'm very conscious of wanting to kind of grow in my understanding of how to communicate in a way that kind of creates stories that people engage with. So this is my kind of, this is preamble before we get into the details of tonight, but it's for, as Alec, you were saying, you started to open your house and you're inviting folks over, and I think that is, if you like, the way in which very often church works. Church in that abstract concept rather than the kind of concrete, registered charity that lives in wherever, but the concept of the body of Christ as we pass on one from another, as people opening their homes, opening their stories. I was walking my dogs this morning, and there was a lady I haven't seen for about a year, and I said, I haven't seen you for a while, and she's been treated for cancer. So at the very, as we only had a couple of minutes in passing as we were going through, and another lady came over and she's talking about the fact she still was receiving treatment from cancer. So I was able to drop in the fact that, actually I know what cancer treatment is like. And it didn't get much beyond that. It wasn't the kind of, sudden quick here preaching for repentance, but we share what we've got in those moments, and that's very natural. It feels very natural, and actually we do have good news. It's not something to impose on people. It's actually, we have a hope. And that's really where I was hoping to kind of just finish with this morning in our brief interaction, and we'll see each other again in the weeks to come as you cross over, is we have seeds of, I have a story that has hope in it. And actually this story, the gospel story, has a massive hope in it. And I just want to find those ways of sharing those things. So anyway, that was rather long-winded, isn't it? So these things that I just wanted to kind of say up front then about, and as I'm learning how people learn is as well, taking on that element of, if you involve them in something, and if we kind of put game elements and challenges, it's incredible the way the human brain is wired. It wants to kind of engage with an environment where it has a certain amount of freedom, but it also has a certain amount of structure and direction. It wants the environment to give them direction, but it wants to have some freedom to explore within that. But very often the way we teach, and I do it, so I'm and although I am actually kind of conscious of this when I teach, but you're given a platform and you talk at people. And so when I am given those platforms, because it is a format we all know, and it's not a bad one, Jesus sat down to teach, but actually is that the way in which we deliver, I always kind of consciously pray that thing of you want to give people mini challenges and almost inspire them to start thinking about other things. You almost want to inspire people to let their minds wander. But on the basis of the things you're giving them. So you're kind of then giving them some direction and some encouragement. But then you're saying, now take this and play with it. What does it do in your mind? How does it get you thinking? And that, when I hear a good preach, that's what it does in me. I often find myself thinking about things that aren't technically part of the preach, but they were inspired by it. You start to kind of go off, and that's very engaging. And people learn a lot more if you can give them things that allow a kind of two-way play. But don't take away the ability or the nature of the fact, because there is benefit to it. You can see this psychologically if you give it some direction. So I'm providing direction, but hopefully the way I'm delivering it or the things we're doing are giving you something that you can juggle with and play with, and that engages the mind. So that's very key. Another little element. Sorry, I think. One of the things, I should say sorry for that, because I say sorry the whole time. I get told off all the time that I say sorry too much. But I'm just delivering what I don't think was really on tonight's program, but it feels kind of okay at the moment. Is the place of humour. And just some of you will be aware that one of the other things I do is kind of coaching at a kind of psychological level. And so although I'm I am an amateur, I look at the whole psychology of well-being and so on. And in a secular context, I can take people on a bit of a journey. The thing, as I often say on this, is fascinating, is it always has a moral dimension to it, because actually at the heart of all emotional well-being, the one factor that's always there is other people. and when it comes down to it, it's other people who you're being nice to, not other people you're being unkind to. So there's always a moral element that comes with this. But one of the things I've found is the role of humour. And I just thought I'd share a couple of thoughts on this, because it actually, if you stop and think about it, humour is more fundamental to communication than words are. And you can say that from observation, which is when a child is just 3 months, it will laugh if you communicate with it, as long as it's the right kind of thing. So you do peekaboo, you kind of cover the eye, peekaboo. And universally, a child, as they start to understand the world, will start to giggle. If you can, and so what's going on there is the question. And the thing that's been found is that all social mammals actually laugh. So chimps laugh, even rats laugh. It's just we can't hear it. And so the question psychologists have is what's going on when we laugh, and it's really revealing, because it gets right to the psychology of being in a safe place to receive something. And so good teaching, therefore, often will have elements of humour in it, because the way it works, if you're interested, probably not, but I'll tell you anyway, is that the part of the brain that we sometimes refer to that makes the right at the kind of the base of what they sometimes refer to as the primitive brain, but it's right at the kind of it drives a lot of the subconscious processes, where the fight or flight mechanism is right alongside that is another nerve that we sometimes refer to as the feed or breed, or rest and digest, and the two kind of are there, but they're sort of separate. But humour happens because the two kind of hit in sync, and they work. And actually, when the two are in sync, you can show that people are at their most their optimum for performance, for learning new things, and all of those sorts of things. And humour actually brings the two into alignment. So it's kind of been measured, and the way it does it is that when you do peekaboo or whatever, Alec, you've got grandchildren, so you're fresh up with this. When you're doing that, is you're giving the child a shock, which hits the fight or flight mechanism, you see, but it resolves very quickly. Its little intelligence has resolved and realizes that it's safe at the same time, and so that triggers the feed or breed, and the two kind of just for a moment kind of hit in sync. And if you're feeling stressed, all of the hormones that go with stress, for a second, they just have a release and they disappear. So it's impossible to be laughing and to be unhappy, is one way of putting it. The profound thinker Bobby Ball, I think, said that one. It's impossible to laugh and be unhappy at the same time. But actually, it's true. And it provides, and so it's in a strange way, that's why, if you've gone through a tragedy, you're very stressed, you're very upset, that actually it's not inappropriate. It's why very often people will make a totally inappropriate joke, because actually what happens in that place is the moment of, if you like, shock, which is what they're already feeling, is kind of, it's kicked in by the setup, because the setup of a joke is kind of something I don't know, and that could be a shock. But then at the same time, it suddenly resolves in a safe way, and it releases a valve, and you just for a moment, all of the pressure just lifts off, just for a fleeting moment. So it's not a bad thing. But the key thing really in all of that was just to say, finding a way of being light and amusing as we deliver and we teach is a really important thing. I think it's something that Jesus does. So I won't say this every time, it's just the first in this. This sort of thing. And so it very much when I'm thinking about trying to deliver something, I have this kind of question in my head, is how do we make it playful, how do we make it light, but at the same time how do we embody what someone needs to know? And actually the program itself can't embody, well, no, if I try and prepare the material so much that and just deliver it at people, there's so much that they, in many ways, the things that they really need will get lost as you kind of shove it all at them. But we need to come to the, if you like, to the table that we set up to explore Jesus together. Hopefully doing this tonight is as we kind of come to this table is as the one who's setting the direction for these things to be explored in. I need to know far more than I'm going to deliver, but we need to find ways of delivering it in a way that we can respond and react, and in a way that's kind of amusing, it's engaging, and so on for the people who are listening. So that's probably all sounds. It's a long. How long have we been going? It's a long time on the kind of blooming obvious, really, isn't it? But it's worth kind of just taking that time to think about and remind ourselves as to we're not just about delivering truth, but we're actually about delivering life and sharing life rather than delivering truth. So anyway, let's get on to all I wanted to do tonight was look at the material we've got in here, but to look a little bit deeper. Because you're guys who might and think about how we might do it in a small group in a way that's more interesting or fun. So I think I'm going to skip past. Where's my cursor gone? When I don't touch it for a while, my cursor disappears. Where is it gone? Sorry. Ah, there it is. Right, it's reappeared now. Okay, so the setup. So we're going to look at the different places and use the kind of looking at the places, not as information, but as we're setting up a story. And so it's not just obviously the last week, which we're going to look at and how we might deliver in small groups and so on, but actually just the story of Jesus itself, and next month at the Emmanuel Centre we're doing the ministry years, so a bit like we had the manual here for the last week, and we should have a manual for that one, which will be the ministry years. It's currently in production. It's much too long, so we're trying to trim it all down. Hopefully it will be there on time, and it will be like this. It won't be perfect, but it will give a whole load of information in a way that can be used and so on. So as we just thought, we'll try and do this in a way that if you want to push your microphone button and ask a question, please do as we kind of go along. So obviously the last week takes place around Jerusalem. It's where the action all takes place. So just kind of getting a feel for it, that's what we want people to kind of get a sense of. There are various estimates of the population. I put there it's approximately 120,000. There are sometimes you hear estimates of millions, up to 2 million though at Passover. So it's the figure that Josephus reckons on. There's a much smaller number that were there when it was finally destroyed, because an awful lot of people had realised it was getting dangerous and had left. So it's kind of estimated that at the time of the crucifixion, there's probably about 120,000 people. So in that sense, it's not the equivalent of a modern city in any sense. It's not much bigger than the town I live in Maidenhead, and probably is smaller than some of your towns and bigger than others. But we all know those kinds of places. I'm just trying to think. I should have looked up a town. There may be someone here who knows one. I don't know. So Barry, how big's Southend? Do you know? See if Barry's going to answer. No, he's. I don't think he's really there. He appears on the guest list, but he's probably having his tea right now. But Southend might be about 120,000. So it's all going to happen in Jerusalem. So in the downloadable files, and just in case you've joined.
Yep, and me.
Kristen, are you there still?
It looks like Kristen's mic is on mute.
Yeah, it looks like he's gone. We all hear each other here.
Hear me?
I can hear everybody else, but not him.
So how
Yeah.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
you're back.
So when did I stop? When did I disappear?
Just with the new change of the slide.
Okay, but it must have been when I was trying to get my cursor back. I must have accidentally clicked on mute. Okay.
Well, you got breakup. We got breakup.
I know. I keep getting a message popping up saying your connection is failing, and then it comes back and says your connection is all fixed. So
Well, you're coming through clear now.
okay, all right.
For us. Hopefully everybody else.
I'll get rid of this. Okay, so all I was saying then, so we've gone through the Jerusalem 120,000. In the downloadable files, which I was just explaining, I've given, if you click on the if you haven't noticed already, the little blue buttons at the bottom. There's one with a screen with an arrow from it. You should be able to get to a thing for attachments, and I put 3 files in there because the idea with these files is I'll use them tonight, but you can put them into documents, print them out, use them as handouts and so on in a small group, and it's part of this interactive side. So you've got in there one which is this map here of Jerusalem. What I should have done is actually put the previous map of Jerusalem, that one as well, which I use as the game board, but it's not a very good map of Jerusalem, but you could have it if you'd like. So I can add that one to the mix. But there's this particular map in there, and you can, as I say, you can print it out. And what I'd suggest is you could almost, as a kind of a way of making, is perhaps to print out some of the information we're going to look at for different locations, and kind of get people to kind of pin them onto it's kind of like pin the tail on the donkey. So let's try and work out where places. So rather than just kind of here's the sheet and it's all on there, but why not engage people as you go through? So we kind of introduce somewhere. Let's think about where is it? Does anyone recognise it? Does anyone where from this description? Where does this go? And so one of the other downloadables, one of the other attachments I've given you, has got some of the rough notes that I pulled together, which I put into tonight. Just for speed's sake, quite a lot of them simply come from Wikipedia. Because I didn't have time to kind of type up long things from elsewhere, so I just kind of pulled a few sentences off Wikipedia about some of the places. But you could kind of put some of those onto some cards. You could maybe not put the names, or you could say what does this sound like? Let's put a name on it. You can kind of do those things, but actually getting people to engage or to have their own map and to write on it, kind of put their own labels on and so on, will make it a little bit more engaging and interesting. So I put here, so here's Jerusalem, so can you place the following? So we're kind of going through the list. So the Tyropoeon Valley, I don't even know how to say that, to be honest. I've got my little quote here. Now what's the point of me introducing, I don't normally do this, it's not in the manual, but I just thought tonight, if you were doing this and you've got that map, I've got this little kind of, you can see on there the loop, the Tyropoeon Valley. It's simply, Josephus says, now the valley of the cheesemongers, and the Tyropoeon is it seems to be cheesemakers. It's the congealers or something, I think is what it means, the people who do the congealing. So now the valley of the cheesemongers, as it's called, and that which we told you before, distinguished the hill of the upper city from that of the lower. So, the high parts from the low parts, extended as far as Siloam. Because that's the name of a fountain which has got sweet water in it, and this is great and plenty also. That's Josephus talking. So my only reason for introducing the valley of Tyropoeon is because it's the cheesemongers, and I find that vaguely amusing, and particularly if, as I did as a 14-year-old, I think I was 13. As a 13-year-old, I broke in to see Life of Brian at Streatham Cinema because I was technically too young to go and see it, but we kind of went in through the boys' toilets. And obviously there are some bits in it that, as I know now, were kind of a little bit more insulting than I probably realised at the time. But there is that very kind of good moment, let's say good moment, where the crowd listening to the Sermon on the Mount have heard "Blessed are the peacemakers" as "Blessed are the cheesemakers." So for no other reason than the fact that it kind of is vaguely amusing, and the fact I can't say the name. I like to kind of just throw that little challenge out there. If you've got the map, is who knows where the valley of Tyropoeon is? If we're kind of running through the the slides here. I've also included another map, which I think has got something like good detail. It's in the title if you're downloading those attachments, which you can kind of print onto something and print out. And I say the reason I like this map is it's got all of the right labels in all the right places, to put it that way. So you can use this as a kind of as a good reference. And you probably can't see it on the screen now, but if you have downloaded it and you open it, you can actually follow the line of the Tyropean, you know what I'm saying. You can follow it runs down the side of the side of the temple, and so that there are kind of two sides to the city with a kind of a rift in the middle, and particularly around the temple. And now this is now information is the kind of thing, if you're doing this with a group, you see, you can start to explain, particularly around the ridge of the temple, it kind of gets filled in, and huge amounts of walkways and bridges join the two kind of crests. And technically the two hills are they kind of, although their definitions change over time, are considered to be Mount Zion and Mount Moriah. So Mount Zion, which is the ridge in which the old city of David was, that runs up to the temple, and then kind of the other side is Mount Moriah, is the way it was thought of at one point. But at different points in Jewish history, the definitions of the hills kind of move around. So just to be aware, you can often read a description online, but actually nobody's 100% sure exactly how it was understood in Jesus' day. But the two places are both there, if I can put it that way. And there's this kind of rift in between them, and that's the valley of the cheesemongers. The people who congeal stuff together, that's where it is. So that's introducing the city. Let's make it alive, make it real. So suddenly understand it's now in two parts. And those two parts, on the one side we have the military, that we're going to think about them, the fort of Antonia, and we've got the Jerusalem temple, and then it runs to the old city of David, which at the moment I'm not sure who lives there. I've tried looking it up, but you kind of hear, and this was it's the kind of that part of that ridge is the lower part if you follow it on the map, and then you've got this kind of little ridge, and on the other side, as the mountain goes up, probably the top of the Mount Moriah, and they kind of join towards the top end, or they actually no, they don't join, they never quite join, but as it kind of rises up, you get to the wealthier houses are on the hill, and down the hill the cheaper houses we're going to see. So start to kind of feel this place as a real location. So it said there that it runs all the way down to the pool of Siloam, which doesn't really come into the last week, the Easter story, but it does come into the Gospels, of course, because Jesus famously tells the blind man to go and wash at the pool of Siloam. That's at the Feast of Dedication, just before it's the Feast of Tabernacles, I think, is where that happens. And so we're told that valley runs down to the pool of Siloam, which means we actually have been able to identify it from an archaeological point of view. It's at the bottom end, right where the walls are. I've kind of put that little circle that you can see on the thing there. But the pool of Siloam was it emerged in the days of Hezekiah. So we read about it in 2 Chronicles. So again, this is in the one of the documents that I've made available, so you can download. It's got these rough notes and verses. It's not very tidy. It was all done in a rush. But we can read the story in 2 Chronicles. That it says he's blocking up the sources of the water of the upper Gihon. So the Gihon spring was up the hill, and it was that running water that was used in the first temple, at least in the first temple, possibly even the second. But it was there used in the first temple for washing away the blood and so on. And he led them straight down on the west to the city of David. So if you can imagine, up on the crest of the hill, the city of David, the spring is flowing, and it's thought that it probably flowed off to the east. And what Hezekiah is doing by diverting it to the west is he's diverting it more into the city. So in 2 Kings we read now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and all his might, and how he made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? So the implication is that the spring used to flow and it used to run eastwards, but because of the waterworks, the channeling, the canal work that Hezekiah put in place, and those things have been excavated and dug up. It's kind of one of those exciting moments in archaeology when they found, yeah, this really does happen. It really is an underground channel. It runs the water down to a repository, the pool, which is right there at the bottom, and it's thought, I think I've got this on here, yes, it's likely, I've got it in the red text here, it's likely that the whole strategy of Hezekiah was not so much to put a source of water in the city, because they already had a source of water in the city, that was the spring of Gihon, but it was to make sure that all of the water stayed in the city, so that it doesn't become, if you like, a resource for those who are besieging you, because he does this work to prepare the city for the siege from the Assyrians. So he doesn't want the Assyrians to get there and be being fed by water that they ought to be drinking, so he diverts it. And so in this kind of other map, if you are doing this with your group, you can see there's a lovely big pool right there in the bottom corner. And very helpfully, we're told, if you put the bits together, that it's right by the dung gate. And the dung gate is so cool because, if you remember, and again, this is storytelling, you see, so I'm not so much giving it to you as teaching, it's more because probably if you've ever come to me, listen to me talking through these places, I probably not reference these things, but often they're just there and you never know when you might drop them out or someone asks something. But the point of the dung gate is that you're supposed to kind of go outside the camp to do your business, and so actually the Hinnom Valley, which is to the south of Jerusalem, so out that way, is where most of the kind of human waste and refuse and other things were to go. And so obviously by coming out here by the pool, which was a great pool for cleansing as you came into the city, so you could wash in it and so on, there was the gate was referred to as the dung gate because Hinnom was a valley full of rubbish, basically, is the way of understanding it. So we've introduced the city. We see, okay, there's a ridge down it, the valley of the cheesemakers, the cheesemongers. Water runs down the city of David, so there's always water in the city. It's one of several ways, but this is the key way. This has been excavated. We understand something about now the kind of the hygiene of the city, because obviously in any city, the issue of fresh water and hygiene was a really key one, and there were various aqueducts that fed into the city of different sizes. The Romans developed and so on as well. So we're just kind of beginning to get this picture of Jerusalem. So now we're going to think about the Essene quarter. So you could imagine, as I said, I'm doing this because of time and everything else. I'm doing the presenting, which I said don't try not to do. But you could imagine and say, okay, who knows? What do we know about the Essenes? Where do we think they lived? How does this help? Now, the Essene quarter is key because it's the location where Jesus seems to eat the Last Supper. There's a whole lot of things that come together in our understanding of the fact that Jesus eats his Last Supper in the Essene quarter. There's the description of the man carrying water, which is evocative of an Essene. There's church tradition that says it's the house of John Mark, and that John Mark's family have their house in this sector of the city. And then there's some other things which we're going to see in a minute that kind of tie. We see the reference or the relationship of the Essenes with the early Christian church. But the Essene quarter, I'm kind of giving you a clue up front because I put that on the map. But it's down in that bottom. If you're looking at it, it's in the south side, over on the west. But about the Essenes, they're a strange group in that we know a huge amount about the way they structured and did their life and society, and yet there are still some scholars who don't even believe they existed. And the reason is probably because the title is a little bit generic, if I can put it that way. In other words, that the group weren't tightly defined in the kind of the way that we often think of them, but they gravitated, it seems, around a number of kind of key teacher priests. And it was a reactionary movement against the temple. But as a result, even though things like the Qumran, you see, this is where, so Pliny, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So it's Pliny is the first person to mention them in terms of when he wrote. So before the destruction of Jerusalem, Pliny writes a letter where he talks about 4,000 Essenes who live in Roman Palestine, which covers Judea and further afield as well. And that they had a community in the desert, which is Qumran. Well, I say it's Qumran. That was why Qumran, when it was found, was identified with the Essenes. There are other reasons now, but when it was first found, it was, aha, look, they've found all of these documents and it belongs to a community, and we're told by Pliny that the Essenes had a major commune out there. Yes, as I say, they seem to be more driven by as a reactionary thing against the priesthood, but they were very devout in their spirituality. The Essene word, the name Essene, probably derives from the Aramaic version of the Hebrew word chassid. You think, how does chassid sound like Essene? But in Aramaic it's chasaiya, so it's the Essia bit becomes Essene. That's a very typical way of ending in both Greek and I think in Hebrew as well, with a sound on the end. Kind of, it's something like that, something that belongs to that. So those that are holy, or the saints, the holy ones, is what Essene comes from. Which is kind of interesting. I'll just throw in this little kind of New Testament. See, what I'm doing here isn't necessarily something that's part of the presentation, but it's kind of the background that makes the stories, to help to kind of understand what's kind of going on. And something to do with the New Testament story is what's really interesting is that the Essenes are called the third sect by Josephus. There are 4 sects, I think, altogether, aren't there? Including the Zealots, but he refers to them as the third. And so as the third sect, it's interesting that all the other sects are mentioned in the New Testament, but we never find the word Essene ever. But that little word chassid, which then gets translated, that word chassid is used in the Old Testament at places where a Greek word, which is eulabes, eu is good, labes, I'm not quite sure, good workers, I think, something like that, isn't it? So the good works people, where those ones, that's the word that's used in the Greek version of the Old Testament for chassid. And we do find that word in the New Testament, so it's just worth noticing, because it probably is implying, it probably is talking about the Essenes. It's just not using that word. That word which we got from Josephus and Pliny seems to be an outsider's words, because of the, rather than a kind of strongly held badge, it was a kind of more of a process and a practice that is badged this way. And so it's perhaps the New Testament is using eulabes as a reference to this group that we then just translate it as devout men. That's what it says in my Bible. In all 3 of those places there were devout men. So on 3 occasions, one of them is Simeon, who is referred to as a devout man, a eulabe. And then there's a distinct group on the day of Pentecost. There are Jews from all over the world, and there are devout men from all over the world. And we know from Pliny that the Essenes were spread out all over the empire in almost every city. Josephus says the same. So perhaps that devout men is actually a reference to an Essene segment. And they're also a group that, just so they're on the day of Pentecost, they're also a group that actually respond and bury Simon, referred to as the devout men. So it's just interesting to notice that there's a sizable kind of section, or is a section of Jerusalem that it seems was handed over to them because in the early days of the kind of the Jewish renewal in the intertestamental period, so between the end of the Old Testament, the beginning of the New, and under the Hasmonean kind of revolution, the Hasmonean family, Simon Maccabeus, Jonathan Maccabeus, and so on. They were originally very kind of pro that whole family, but they then rejected the priesthood, which were being taken over by the Hasmoneans, and there was a falling out at that point. But in those early days, it seems that probably for military service and their kind of devotion to the Lord and so on, that was part of the foment that meant that Judea re-established itself as an independent nation at a time when the world was dominated by empires. It was quite a remarkable period of history. And the Essenes kind of emerge in that context, and it's probably as a result that they are given a section of Jerusalem which they kind of dominate, because they have certain practices that mean it's easier for them to do it together. So this is just telling the kind of the story. So it's estimated, I've tried to work out, I've found this on several places, but I can't actually work out where they've got it from. I guess very often when you see these things, it's kind of careful picking through the references and getting little inferences here and there. But it's estimated there are about 50 Essene Kohanim, i.e. priests, who are living in that southwest corner of Jerusalem. So that's quite a density, a city of 120,000. And some of what we think of the Essenes is probably only held by the priestly leaders, if I can put it that way. So, for instance, Pliny tells us that that in the Essene communities there's not a single woman, but Josephus says no, that's not the case, and some of them did marry and some of them didn't. And it's probably a kind of a sense in which you say that the kind of the key figures were often the priestly ones. So John the Baptist obviously fits the mould for one of these. He's from a priestly family, just as the original movement of the Essenes was a priestly movement. So he's from a priestly family. He rejects the temple, but he continues to exercise his priestly kind of duties, and they had certain ways in which they did it. So there are about 50 priestly Essenes, it's estimated, living in the Jerusalem quarter. And Josephus also helpfully describes the location of the Essene Gate, which is a kind of a properly labelled gate, and which actually allowed it to be excavated right back in 1894, which was then reconfirmed in 1977. Because obviously the earlier work, so much had happened in Jerusalem, they wanted to go and reconfirm. And actually it was very kind of precise. They dug a hole and found it pretty much where it should be because of the way it's kind of described in Josephus, which is kind of good circumstantial evidence for helping us understand the shape of the city. So the Essene quarter, as an idea, is strongly supported then by kind of secondary archaeological discoveries, i.e., for instance, which sounds, and again, these scatological details really make some people feel sick, and for other people they make them memorable. But for instance, from an excavation point of view, that there was a covered latrine found just outside Jerusalem, to the northwest, which is exactly where it's described in the Qumran temple scroll. So the temple scroll talks about this priestly devotion and how they behave, and it talks about the building of a covered latrine outside the camp and so on, and it kind of all precisely fits. So this is what I mean by secondary evidence. Part of the reason for explaining this is also to helpful to understand is all of the maps. I've used 3 maps of Jerusalem so far. And if you look at them, they're all slightly different, and that often is confusing. And the reason for that is because Jerusalem has sat at probably the most volatile. It's the major city sitting at the most volatile place on the planet. 3 continents all kind of joined together at Jerusalem, and and so its history is of being destroyed, rebuilt, old stones being reused. Is so massive that actually it's much harder than people think sometimes to be able to recreate a single moment and say that's exactly how things looked, because you go down and you find the remains of something, you carbon date them and you say they're from this period, but then actually you discover that actually it's alongside and built together with something from a different period. So you have to kind of piece all the bits together, and of course if things have been layered over and all sorts of different generations and and so on. And so as a result, it's a kind of a combination of what we can say for a fact from archaeology, mixed with the descriptions that we have from the rabbis and from Josephus and so on. And when you're doing that, there's a degree of artistic license involved. And so that's just something to be aware. As I say, I've given you 2 maps that you can use. And if you use you can go and look online, you'll find others, and you'll find they're all slightly different. They'll be roughly very often in the same place, but with minor variations, and we'll think a little bit about that. It's useful sometimes to understand that in case someone asks the question, the map in the back of my Bible's got it slightly differently, that kind of question. Just to say, that this is the kind of trying to fit things together as best as possible. And I think we can have a sort of a 90% certainty of most of the ones that you're going to see. It's just the 10% that we argue about, but that's the reason for it. Oh, here you go. Here's the description. It's in your notes, I think, of the you shall make a place for a hand outside the city, to which you shall go out to the northwest of the city, roofed buildings with pits within them, into which the excrement will descend. There you go. Sorry to be crude. And it won't be visible from any distance from the city, 3,000 cubits. So there's the description of it, and actually that's apparently one of those things that can be found and be excavated. and actually, sorry, I'm losing my excavations around the gate of the Essenes also which would have provided therefore the main route to get to them from the description, shows multiple ritual bathing pools, and we know that actually in re-entering the city, the Essenes would have all have ritually washed. So they leave the city and they go round to their specially built outside covered toilets, and as they return, there's the archaeological evidence of these small quick bathing pools, which are probably fed by wells from just inside the Essene quarter. Because they often for water that they would use for cleaning, it wasn't to be kind of being used by non-Essenes. It was kind of they had that sort of approach to it. Now that all, sorry, this is rather a long, a very small section here. It all kind of comes together because when we're telling the story of the last week, we're going to see the way we're telling the story. We see Jesus eating the Last Supper in a household in the Essene quarter. And that he has met a man carrying a pitcher of water, which is something that normally men don't do, but the Essenes did. So it probably means that the guy that they meet and they follow goes back to a household within the Essene quarter and is probably Essene himself, which doesn't mean that the household is celibate, because as we said, that's probably the keener, the leadership layers. And as Josephus said, so it can be John Mark's house, it can be his family, and that all kind of is fitting together. And if that is the case, he may well have been drawing from a well which they were reluctant to let non-Essenes draw from. So they don't go and take water out, but they see him getting water in his pitcher and so on. So it's all part of the story, it's all part of the background kind of details. But better keep going. Oh, here we go. So if you were doing it on that flat map, if you printed that on a piece of paper, it's this kind of bottom corner here, and there's little, right in that very kind of corner edge is where the Essene gate would be, so you could then head up to the north and to the east to your facilities. So next section, if you're asking people, is the lower city. Okay, so the lower city is kind of much more the area where your regular housing and your trade is taking place. And it's very possible. So a lot of craftspeople and tradespeople have kind of facilities there. And it's probably the kind of location where we like to find Jesus's family during the Passover week. As we tell the story, obviously John, it seems, gathers Mary in. And then we meet during that week Clopas, who is the uncle of Jesus on his father's side, according to Eusebius, who is passing on the tradition from the earlier church. So Clopas and his son, who's the early church tells us his name is Simon, who are then on the road to Emmaus. And what's interesting to note, so Jesus' family are there in Jerusalem. And it's likely that they will be here because this is where kind of tradespeople tend to have their relationships and where they have their properties. It's interesting as well. They probably are leaving from John's house. John, there's a high probability, is a cousin of Jesus too. And there's another alternative, but let's not go there right now. John is probably, therefore, that house is in that same kind of region, this lower quarter. And interestingly, because obviously Jesus comes from a building family, we translate it as carpenter, but the word tekton is more generic than specifically kind of what we think of as a carpenter. It's someone who works in building. So his family come from a building community, and there is always building work going on in Jerusalem because the temple has been expanded for over 46 years. Interestingly, there is also major building work at this period going on at Emmaus, which is interesting, isn't it? See, now this is a little family connection going on here. So this is where the tradespeople are. We know that there are members of Jesus's family who are there in the story, and two of them leave wherever they've been staying in Jerusalem as a result on resurrection morning of the fact that one of the women is married to Mr. Clopas. She's the wife of Clopas, comes back and tells him about an angel, and says that the angel said to tell his family. And so then we find Clopas and Simon on the road to Emmaus, which is a region that at the time is going through a major rebuild. So just kind of putting all the bits together, you see how it's not, if you like, gospel. Can't say this is exactly what's going on, but you can see how the the picture emerges. Is that making sense? So here's the lower city. I've got these descriptions which I've got put into your notes, and I've tidied up a little bit as I put them here. Which kind of I found this is a descriptive one describing different parts of Jerusalem. So it said this about the lower city: along the small market streets in the lower city, Jerusalem's craftsmen lived and worked. Weavers, dyers, potters, bakers, tailors, carpenters, metal workers. Merchants sold fruit and vegetable, dried fish, sacrificial animals, clothes, perfume, and jewellery. And now you see, notice all of those things because Salome and Mrs. Clopas, both of whom are related to Mary. So they're members of Jesus's family, his wider family, and tradespeople. Salome is in the fishing business, and there's dried fish there. Clopas is probably in the building business. There they go. It says after the Sabbath they went to buy spices. So on the evening of that Saturday, before the Sunday morning, the markets reopened, and this is the region of the city where they would have done it. So anyway, going on, the streets are always crowded and busy, especially on Mondays to Thursdays, the main market days. Perishable goods were on sale every day, so you got the kind of comments about it. So after travelling, you could stop and rest at any one of Jerusalem's taverns or restaurants. So there are taverns and restaurants in the area as well. And for a long time they have been organised into professional groups, and most of them worked in public shops. But again, it gives you a kind of a sense, this idea of professional groups and so on, and the kind of concentrated location, as to how John, who has been there and watched Jesus being tried, well, the beginning of the trial, he's watched the discovery phase at the house of Annas. He disappears when the sun comes up and Jesus gets sent before the Sanhedrin. He leaves at that point. But we then find by the time Jesus is standing before Pilate that he has collected members of Jesus's family. And it's probably through this network in the lower city of associated groups and tradespeople and so on, that, and the fact that they're members of family and so on, he knows where to go to and where to find them. In Jesus' time, we know there are about 480 synagogues in Jerusalem, and most of those are down in this lower region. So obviously if there's a lower city, there is also an upper city. So what can we say about the upper city? I would say, because I'm doing this at a bit of a speed. Oh, hang on, I put that the wrong way around, haven't I? That should still say I've put the upper city final slide before I put the intro slide. Does anyone want to ask anything at this point? Because I have been talking a lot.
Just an interesting little note I've just picked up there. You said there's 480 synagogues?
Yeah, that's the number I found.
And the population was, what was it, 1,200?
120,000.
120,000. Oh, sorry, 120,000. I've got my note out.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's interesting. So that's about 30 people per
synagogue then.
Yeah, roughly. I'm just thinking about in sort of our church sizes and chapels and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, and this is a really good, because, as I said, I'm a great believer in that a lot of detail happens in smaller groups, even the fact we're a smaller group here. And because obviously the word synagogue actually means to learn together. It's what it actually, and obviously if a group gets too big, it's interesting, isn't it, that from a church growth point of view, people often say, an average congregation be about 70, but an awful lot of them are only about 30. So it's probably not dissimilar to the kind of thing we're seeing here in Jerusalem. But this again. Obviously, there are no definitive lists. These are different historians trying to estimate these things from comments and references in different documents and so on at different times. Which is why I put that approximate and even that number. It's estimated. So you juggle around with them, but yeah. So anyway, the upper city, which I put is for the great and the good, and actually is. Just topographically, it's actually higher than the rest of Jerusalem. Even the Temple Mount, it's higher than the temple. It was replanned and it was rebuilt by Herod. He kind of took Roman architecture and used Roman engineering kind of ideas in the layout of the streets, and used large blocks and wide streets and plazas and palaces and public buildings and so on. So it was full of the rich. The houses were so big initially that it was thought that they were all Romans, but as it turns out, it's as time has gone on, we do more and more research. Romans didn't tend to like to live in Jerusalem because Jerusalem was quite antagonistic towards them. So even Pilate only would spend about 4 months of the year actually in Jerusalem. He would kind of base himself out in Caesarea on the coast most of the time and so on. And they would just come in at certain times and so on. So and actually as more and more of the buildings have actually been excavated, it's turned out that they were priestly on the whole. So they belonged to the ruling class, the Hasmonean families, and the descendants, the Sadducees, as they are, as a group who control the temple, are the people who actually live there. So we find it's kind of, there are buildings that they're sometimes referred to as palaces. So the Hasmonean palace is up there. So that was there before Herod rebuilt the area. Herod's palace was there. There's a kind of a priestly palace, which is often referred to as Caiaphas's, but I think realistically, kind of, as we say, he's the presiding priest, but Annas is just as relevant. And so large kind of mansions and so on. And this is the area, of course, where Jesus is tried and where he is executed, where the crowd calls for Barabbas. But it's not a general. It's a bit like if a public trial happened, kind of, in a gated community in Mayfair. You're not getting a really representative cross section of the population. It's not that it's totally walled and people can't come in, but early in the morning, as the trial happens, the kind of people who are milling around in the streets there are not your everyday Jerusalemites. So they need to be there for a reason. Either they've been brought in by the authorities to shout, or they happen to live in the area, or servants in the households of the area, or they're Jesus's family, or people that know what's going on who've come into the area. So, yes, here we go now. The temple, look at that nice little moving one. The temple, of course, is the scene where all the action takes place. It just kind of thinking about the from a storytelling point of view. The second temple, of course, was originally built by. Have I got it on this slide? Or was it on another slide? I think I referred to it. Here it is on here. Is rebuilt under Zerubbabel as the governor, which we read about obviously in the minor prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, for instance, and in the book of Ezra, we read about how they come back and they start rebuilding the temple, and then there's a delay and then they get it finished, and but it's been destroyed several times and restored and rebuilt, but it's always referred to as the second temple. And the final kind of rebuilding has kicked off under Herod in 19 to 17 BC. And that kind of pushes itself into the gospel narrative, because we read at the beginning of John's gospel when they say to Jesus, and he talks about pulling down the temple and I'll rebuild it. And they say, it's been, you're not 46, are you? I think is the kind of phrase. In other words, at that point, it's 46 years since the area where Jesus is standing at that point, which is the outer court, has been built, and which probably started around 17 BC. So I kind of put that therefore as 29 AD, because you lose a year because there's no zero. So it kind of starts to give a bit of shape to the timing, if you like, of Jesus' story, because we can kind of add those years to when we know from a historic point of view, Herod had started to rebuild the temple. As he rebuilt the temple is when he was rebuilding the upper city at the same time. So yeah, there you go. There's the temple. We all know where that is. The Fort of Antonia, which is just above it on the map. The Fort of Antonia was built over an older citadel. So during the intertestamental period, there was a Jewish kind of citadel there. Herod rebuilt it. At the time of building it, he was king. He was a vassal king, but he was a king of an independent kingdom. A dependent, not independent, a dependent kingdom. So it was originally built for the nation, for the Jewish nation. But of course, it was eventually, when his son was deposed from governing over Judea, Archelaus, and it came then under Roman control. So he named it after his patron, Mark Antony, which tells us that it must have been, well, no, we can't be sure actually, but from the timing point of view. But obviously Mark Antony puts it around the 30s, but Herod knew him from his early days, so he calls the temple after him. And then we read this in Josephus. So the general appearance of the whole was of a tower, and with other towers at each of the four corners, and 3 of these turrets were 50 cubits high, while at the southeast angle rose up to 70 cubits, so as to command a view of the whole area of the temple. So we regularly people picture it and imagine it. Oh, here it goes on. But he also, they in a way, if I go back, sorry, let's just click back a slide. So that little image there is often the way it's kind of imagined, with 4 kind of turrets, 1 on each corner. So it looks like a single tower, but with 4 turrets. But again, that is an artist's impression from the description, and it's worth just kind of flagging, because again, you'll find from a storytelling point of view, there'll be someone who might know something or have heard something along these lines. So it's worth just being aware of them. It doesn't fundamentally change the flow of the story we tell over to the Easter story, but it's just worth knowing it, which is that Josephus also kind of gives us a little bit of a problem. Because in his description of the siege of Jerusalem, he suggests that there's a separation between the fort and the temple. And he describes 2 walkways that connect up to the temple via 2 colonnades with a narrow space between them. The problem is that he makes reference to this gap as being about a stadia, which is 600 foot. And the problem is the way he describes where the fort of Antonia is. It doesn't allow the fort to move, but if the temple, therefore, is 600 feet away from it rather than butting onto it, which is the way that most maps show it and most models put it, and the way that I've assumed it, because everybody does, it would actually mean that the temple was further south. It's not huge, is it, 600 feet, but it's not trivial either. So just kind of do a quick thing in meters. 600 feet to meters is that's 200 meters, isn't it? Roughly 200 meters. So fifth of a kilometer, which is, it's not insignificant, which would put the Temple Mount actually really starting more in the city of David. So there's of course he doesn't say it's exactly a stadia, and a stadia wasn't an exact measurement, so it's all of those kind of things that you have to feed in, and most translations of Josephus don't translate the thing as a stadia. They kind of make it a space or something like that, so we don't really see it, but it's there. And so there is kind of talk, because obviously you will be aware of, this is the second temple we're talking about, but even if you go on Wikipedia and you look at the current temple, it talks about expectations for a third temple and so on. And so there's always that thing, is if everyone decides in the end that they've got the location slightly wrong, then actually a third temple could go up very quickly. I'll just put it that way, because that was the way it was put to me when it was first described to me. It could happen really quickly if they all decided this is the way it went. So I looked into it and found there is a genuine kind of question mark over the location. The broad consensus is what you see on most maps, but if you occasionally see it further to the south, that's the reason. It doesn't really change the story, but it's all, again, it's part of the way in which, as people kind of get hold of it, to understand in God's narrative, which starts in creation and finishes in Revelation, in right at the beginning, the first use of the word holy is when God he declares the seventh day holy. So that's the first use of the word, the Hebrew word for holy. Second use is a place. It's holy ground. Third use, proper use, because it's then used a couple of times to reference back to the ground and to the day, is a people. So we kind of have holiness kind of goes from place in time, or sorry, a moment in time to a place on the earth, and to becomes a people who become the carriers. Now, why did I go into all that? Oh yeah, because of course the temple is the consolidation. It becomes, if you like, it becomes the place at which you come at certain times, and the people come, if you see what I mean. It becomes this symbol of the root or the foundation of holiness, and of course it's right the way there in biblical imagery, from the creation right the way through to Revelation. Even though in Revelation there is no temple. The temple has now disappeared, because actually God's habitation is now fully within his people. So he's moved from a moment in time to a place on earth, which is then people coming to it. Now it's really in people. So, sorry, that's all a little bit theological, but that's why I kind of get these. This is why these things are kind of interesting, and issues around the third temple and so on. So, whew. Sorry.
Is there a wall left from the temple or something? Is there a little wall? If there's a little wall left, they go and
Yes,
play around.
the Wailing Wall, and
Wailing
so
Wall,
where the Wailing Wall is, if the temple isn't where they thought it was, the Wailing Wall would then be a part of the understanding as part of the Fort of Antonia. So in other words, it would be assumed, therefore, that, because remember, that's why I was explaining that model that I showed you is an artist's impression. What it would mean is that the walls were a bit longer rather than all kind of squeezed together, because at the moment everything's squeezed together because they assume one butts up to the other, whereas we've got this space that kind of implies that there's kind of walkway down, that the steps run down, and that there's quite a distance in Josephus. So, and the people who like that solution, what they would say is that Jesus says not one stone will stand on another, so therefore the stones of the Wailing Wall can't be the stones of
the temple. Yeah, I suppose so, yeah.
You see what I mean? So there you go. So here's a good example, Jason. This is what I mean by get people thinking. If you've got these little bits of background, we can address them and talk to them and so on.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay.
Good. So thanks for that. That's very helpful. So let's keep going. So the fort. So I put it there on this map. You see, it doesn't appear at all. They've solved the problem by just not showing the thing. It's obviously obscured, hidden behind the temple on their map. But the reality is, what Josephus does say is that from the top tower you could see right down over the temple, which obviously the Romans would like that. So the Praetorium. There you go. You see, these ones were. I used these ones when we actually did the Saturday, so that's why they're animated. The other slides I've just thrown in tonight to get tonight across. So the Praetorium, which is the seat of power now, which is over on the east side of Jerusalem. So Herod had built his palace. He constructed it on an elevated platform. If you remember, as we said, it's the upper. This side is called the upper side because it's the higher side of Jerusalem with the two mounts. And on there, he's built it up again. He elevated it again, so it stands quite high. So that it's raised about 1,000 feet higher than the level of the mountaintop. Pardon me. Okay, not 1,000 feet. There's 1,000 feet is how long it is. That's quite a distance. It's 16 feet above the ground level there. Sorry, that's it. It's made up of kind of two main buildings within the complex. It's got banqueting halls, baths, accommodations. There were gardens, there are porticos. Grounds include groves, there are canals and ponds fitted with bronze fountains and so on. These are all kind of descriptions that come from various places. So it's a very luxurious place that Herod built for himself. So obviously when Archelaus was deposed by the Romans for being such a violent and difficult leader, it became the seat of power for Pilate when he was in Jerusalem. But he, as I say, because his presence tended to cause trouble, he wisely only used it for parts of the year. So there it is. Now, the thing that's interesting, and this of course is where Jesus is tried, and as we said, it's right there. It's surrounded by the big houses, the priestly houses, right in that region. But in particular, I want to draw attention to the towers at the top end. Now, there were three towers, and they were part of this kind of complex. They kind of create the top corner of the Praetorium. They part of the wall, and then they kind of blend into the rest of the city. So Herod built these kind of three military towers called Phasael, Hippicus, and Mariamne. So the northwest corner of the first wall, they were built by Herod as part of his new palace. And it's interestingly, when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, the Romans actually left the three towers and were left standing there. And it was the reason for leaving them was to kind of show anybody who walked past how significant their victory was. It was kind of like, look how strong and big and imposing these towers are, if I can get it across. So in explaining that is to say that they really were imposing. in terms of the dimensions and size, and the fact that they're at the top of a hill anyway, and then towers on top, so they kind of gave a really commanding view over the whole kind of region. And for some reason I've got text in tiny, obviously just not being very careful there, right at the bottom. So they were all left by the Romans, but as time went by, only one of them kind of survived to the present day. So we have one stump of a tower, which is thought probably to be the Phasael Tower, but it could be the Hippicus Tower. But it's just worth just looking at and thinking a little bit about each of these towers. Oh, here's the thing from Josephus, sorry. War of the Jews, Volume 7. So Caesar gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and the temple, but they should leave as many of the towers standing as were of the greatest eminency. This is the Phasael, the Hippicus, and the Mariamne, in order to demonstrate to posterity what kind of a city it was, and how well fortified, which the Roman valour had subdued. This was the end which Jerusalem came to by the madness of those that were for innovations. A city otherwise of great magnificence, of mighty fame among all mankind. So when Josephus is writing, what he's saying is, if you want to go and see what Jerusalem was like, you can go and look at the towers, because they got left for those reasons. So the first one, the one that we think may still have a bit of a stump of from an archaeological point of view. The stump is now referred to as the Tower of David, even though the Tower of David, when it was originally built, was right the other side of Jerusalem. It's just the way in which it was an Arab name that was given to it, misreading of the Bible and so on, and it stuck. Phasael, he was named after one of Herod's brothers. And according to Josephus, it's the tallest of the three, and we can estimate, therefore, it's about 150 feet or 46 meters high. So in modern terms, about 15 stories. And its base was 20 meters by 20 meters, and it kind of combined defensive fortifications, but actually it had a massive lavish apartment kind of halfway up, and at the very top as well. So halfway up there was a hall that took up the whole 20 by 20 meter space, so it took up the whole kind of floor space for kind of big meals and banquets and so on. And then above that there were rooms, and there's a bath suite and so on, that's all fed by water. Obviously has to be fed by water, don't know what you bath in, but you know. The second one, Hippicus, was named after a friend of Herod when he was younger, who'd fallen in battle, so he kind of commemorated him. And there's some thought that actually in naming these towers, which is almost certain he would have done, Herod was playing a political game. So Hippicus was seen, and so was Phasael. They were seen very favourably by the kind of ruling authorities in Jerusalem, because of their kind of service in the past to the defence of the city. Whereas Herod himself was seen as a problem, because obviously he'd gone to Rome, he'd raised the Roman army and gone back and taken the kingship by force using foreign soldiers. So he wasn't well liked by the Hasmoneans. So he's used the naming of these towers to kind of to go back to people that have more favour and kind of and associate him with those folks by the looks of it. So it's slightly smaller. It seems to be about 40 meters high. But at the base, it's on a very deep reservoir of water, which is probably used for feeding the rest of the palace complex and so on. So that's Hippicus. Now the one that I think is interesting is the Mariamne, which is named after Herod's wife. It's the one that's described as being the kind of most delicately decorated, and it was beautiful. It rose to about 25 meters. So I've just this comment. It was seen as beautiful and fine. And Mariamne the First is sometimes she's referred to as Mariamne the Hasmonean, because she is a daughter from that dynasty. Now, Herod himself has over 10 wives, and we don't even know all of their names. He has multiple children. Mariamne was his second wife, and is sometimes kind of, you see him as having a certain amount of favour with him, except for the fact that it didn't stop him executing her. I mean, if we kind of, as kids, we do a big thing on Henry VIII and his 6 wives, and a couple of them get executed. He's just like second fiddle when it comes to Herod with wives and executions and family and so on. So Mariamne, though, was known as being extremely beautiful, so the tower becomes extremely beautiful. But Herod's fear of her family, the Hasmoneans, led him to execute all of the kind of prominent members of that family, which actually included his own wife. So yeah, don't know how that works out. Seeing her as being sometimes being thought of as one of his favourite wives, but still one that he executed for political ends. But is what's worth noting, although we call it the Mariamne, actually that's a kind of corrupted spelling that's happened over the years. Josephus just calls her Mariam, but in later kind of copies, the spelling because sometimes he puts it with a double M, and later copies, the two M's become an M and an N, so it's a kind of almost a spelling mistake that comes in by the copyists, and that obscures then the fact that actually her name is simply the name Miriam, which of course when you come through the Latin comes to us as Mary. So the Mariam, the tower, is the Tower of Mary. This is what it means. But of course in Hebrew or Aramaic, Migdal is tower. The little suffix, the Greek suffix here, the nun bit, or n, sorry, not nun, the na bit, Magdalene. So Migdal n turns a noun into an adjective, so we got it down there. So Migdal n is someone of, or someone who's like. And Migdal is a tower. So someone of Magdala, town in the north, or someone who is like a tower, the Migdal, is what Magdalene means. And the reason for just drawing it out is it's a very imposing physical feature of Jerusalem that would have been impossible for the first generation to have heard the story, and this woman who anoints Jesus, who is famous throughout all of the world for what she's done, and Mary, who is called the Magdalene, the tower. It seems very, very strongly to me that the Magdalene bit is a nickname that is more to do with Mary's character, and probably is almost driven by this kind of iconic tower that sits there in people's imagination, than it is that she came from Magdala itself. And as you know, if we've worked through these events in the booklets that we've done, you can see that Mary Magdalene is first introduced at a period when Jesus is down near Jerusalem. So I think put all those bits together to see how it fits together. So that the towers themselves have something to contribute to the story. They tell us a little bit about the politics, but also in people's mindsets, Mary Magdalene actually has an instant visual kind of thing if you hear that name. So we're nearly getting there. we get there, don't worry. Hasmonean Palace is another kind of key location. It sits there right in the middle of the city. It's at the kind of the easterly end of the upper city. His description locates it over the gallery at the passage to the upper city, where the bridge joined the temple to the gallery. So probably one of the ends of that kind of bridge that goes across the Tyrophoeon Valley that runs through, and there's this kind of bridge and this archways that were built up quite extensively across the two. So it sits at the end of that. So its approximate position in the palace is in front of the temple. The location makes it both topographic and administrative sense. Sorry, I knew what I meant when I wrote that. The palace was originally built by the Hasmonean family, so before Herod, and it was their seat of power, and that makes sense because they're kind of at a level, they're looking into the temple, but they're also looking down over the rest of the city, so it's a kind of a good high middle point. So great for kind of administering the city. So it provides the king and the high priest an observation point. There you go, into events there within. That bit I think was copied from Wikipedia. You can tell it's not my language. So there we go. There it is. If you're doing this as a game with your small group, see that perhaps kind of create a description of it and see if they can work out from the map where it might be or what they know about it, or maybe even give them that description of its location, see if that makes sense to them. Final little bit, and then we kind of run through, is when we do this, when we're doing this and we kind of start to tell the story, we also highlight a couple of houses on the map. There are houses, one of which I tend to say to people, you have to put them on there, because when I created my own map, I didn't put it on. But there are a number of people, as we've talked about as we've gone through tonight. Annas has a house, because Jesus gets taken to Annas's house. So Annas's house, we know, will be in the upper city because of who he is, and he's very powerful. It may even be what's referred to as the priestly mansion. It might be Annas's, or it might be Caiaphas's, or they might share it. Maybe they share different apartments within it, but various mansions have been excavated, and we look at the excavation of one of them, which could therefore potentially be Annas's house. But we know therefore roughly where it is. It's always going to be in this kind of on my screen. I'm moving my cursor, but you can't see that. But it's in that kind of western upper city kind of section, whereas the Last Supper house is down in the south of the city on the west side, in the Essene district. John's house and a house where maybe other members of Jesus' family, they're likely to be in the lower city, as we've said, where the tradesmen are, and so forth. So we can kind of put those things in place. And a final kind of thing, there's some Roman bits. On the map that we use as a kind of game board, we have the aqueduct shown, and we've got the hippodrome. The funny thing is, as I say, we kind of imagine these cityscapes. We have to try and put them in place. Josephus refers to a hippodrome, and he also refers to a theatre. But actually, we don't know at all where they are. So they are often put in places by convention rather than by knowledge, which is possibly why I think. If I go back, let's go back a couple of slides. I think it takes us on this map that I've been saying you can print out and use. If you look carefully at it, it doesn't have either the hippodrome nor does it have the theatre. If you look at the map with all of the places on it, you can see they've located them in what are generally the consensus locations for those two items. But it's worth kind of bringing out, because again it challenges sometimes our assumptions of if you like the primitiveness of the city. But it's not. It's a sophisticated Roman city, Jerusalem. The Romans have done an awful lot of building in it at this stage. They were building in it when it was actually run by Herod, because he had been heavily Romanized, and so he brought in their ideas and so on. And then since Archelaus has been deposed, it's been Romanized again. And so there's theatres, there's aqueducts, there's the hippodrome, and so on. And then, of course, locations outside the city. I've got the Mount of Olives and Bethany. I won't do those tonight. And as I touched on this evening, which is of interest, of course, is that Emmaus, just up the road, but on the west side of the city, is at the time of Jesus' crucifixion going through a growth spurt, and therefore is a location for builders. And so it wouldn't be at all unlikely that Clopas and his son, who are members of Jesus' family, are on their way there, because
Lost you again, Kristen.
Can you hear us, Christian? We've lost you.
Looks like you've muted your mic again.
Okay. It seems that when I lose my connection, it turns my mic off. That's really weird, isn't it? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Good.
You're there.
Well, I was almost done anyway. Just making that point. Other places outside the city, other than Mount of Olives and Bethany, of course, is Emmaus within the story, which we touched on earlier, was going through that growth spurt. So it wouldn't be surprising if there are members of Jesus' extended family who are builders, who are resident in Emmaus, which gives us suddenly a reason for why those disciples are on the road to Emmaus when they have their resurrection experience. So there we go. We've taken just over the hour tonight, I think. But the logic there, as I said, is what I'd really like is for folks to have a kind of be lovely to kind of hear back people saying, okay, I just tried, we did this, because you don't have to do everything in one go, but it actually kind of you could talk a lot, and people will pick up an awful lot about the context of the Gospels, which would help their reading of it. If you just do an evening, perhaps, where you, as I say, you put down a map in the middle, so let's kind of add some labels to this. What do we know about stuff? You kind of get those ideas, make it in a kind of an interactive way. So that was my thought really for what we did tonight. But does anyone want to ask anything or make any observations on that? I thought as an idea.
No, I have to go back to some of my books. I remember somewhere I've got the Lion Handbook of the Bible, the original one that had lots of maps and lots of drawings in, and some of your things are sort of familiar there to me. But it'd be interesting to see what they were that had that probably some years ago. It must be 40 years ago.
Yeah. No, they're very good actually, those Lion books, and the thing is, as you know, you'll have a vintage one there, Alec, but you know they keep producing them because they update them and so on as new thing comes along. But what's a really, hopefully, you know, it's one of the things to get out of this evening is often you think, well, I did an awful lot of my own reading, like by the sound of it, you'd have Alec, and I'm sure others who are here tonight do their own. You do your own study and you find it satisfying for your own right. But actually, then there's a big gap between those who aren't going to have the ability to do that. I don't mean that in a patronising way. I mean it in a very real way. We're wired in very different ways. So if we have that ability to absorb these things, to kind of host these times where we pass on the information in ways that are more accessible, does mean that when somebody is reading the Bible for themselves, they are, without realising it, bringing more background in, if I can put it that way. So I as I say, for me there was a kind of transition where I did it all for my personal level, and then it was only a few years ago when I felt the Lord said, now start teaching this. You start thinking, I suppose it's useful to pass this on to other people. You know, I know that there will be others who are wired in similar ways to me who probably read the same things, and that they don't need to know, but somehow let's get it out, and let's not lose the life that's there in the gospel, which, you know, in really good storytelling, all these little things we're looking at, they become part of what makes it interesting because it fits. You know, in other words, it makes sense that Clopas is walking to Emmaus if the angels have said go and tell his family. You know, that kind of thing. It all kind of works.
It's very interesting. I think, as you say, it's walking around. It's somewhere where I don't know if any of you others have been to Jerusalem. I haven't. It's one of the few places I haven't been around the world. But it'd be interesting to go there and to see the sort of sites which you've been talking. I know you have in mind your map.
Well, the funny thing is, I didn't go for years because I didn't want to get sucked into the kind of tourist thing. But now I'm at a place where I've got a certain level of my own understanding. I really do want to go, and I have got someone who keeps saying, I've got contacts. We'll get it arranged at some point. So I'm hoping that at some point I will get an opportunity to go and just check us out, actually walk out some theories and take some photographs of my own. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, Che Armor's trips out there.
I missed that. I think that was you, Jason, but I couldn't hear it.
Joe Cheyan, he does trips out there. I've seen
yes.
adverts for him.
Yeah, a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And Georgian Banov, who always says when I'm there, come and join me. But it's it's finding the right time and so on.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Good. Okay. Well, we'll save the recording. My prayer is that actually it does record, even though we lost connection a couple of times. But
says it's recording, so
yeah, I know. So hopefully it will. I will stop recording and hopefully produce a result.